So this is my third lecture in a series of lectures where I'm discussing criticisms of Elizabeth Anderson's 2015 Tanner lectures and her responses to those criticisms. In this lecture, I'm going to be talking about somebody named Tyler Cowen, who's an economist, and his criticisms of her lectures and her responses to those criticisms. If you want to take a look at my other lectures in this series, I've included them in links to this video. So I want to begin by just noting some common ground between Cowen and Anderson. Neither is arguing for workplace democracy or Adam Smith's vision of an economy characterized by small enterprises and self-employment. Instead, both Anderson and Cowen support the existence of large firms that can take advantage of economies of scale. Both of them support workplace hierarchies in which some have authority over others. Now, a hierarchy of authority is not the same thing as a hierarchy in which there exists authority. In the way that Anderson uses the word, a hierarchy of authority is a hierarchy in which some have arbitrary and unaccountable power over others. And she's certainly against that. But she's not against hierarchies in which some people are bosses and they give orders to their subordinates. So what do they disagree about? Well, the first disagreement has to do with something called, their assessment of how bad conditions actually are for workers on the ground. So I'm going to start with a statement of Cowen's about this. So Cowen writes, "Overall, corporate impositions on worker dignity aren't nearly as great as Anderson makes them out to be. Large numbers of employers go out of their way to make their companies sources of worker dignity, precisely because workers and potential workers value such freedoms and protections." So Anderson gives a very direct response. I'm going to read that too. So Anderson says, "Half of all U.S. workers make less than $29,000 annually." I'm guessing that's about 1/10 of Cowen's income. Had he bothered to check what working conditions are like for workers in the bottom half who toil in agriculture, slaughterhouses, janitorial services, restaurant work, warehouses, call centers, retail sales, domestic service, elder care, the garment industry, prisons, yard work, and unskilled construction and manufacturing work? Going on a little bit, among restaurant workers, 90% report being subject to sexual harassment. Between 2007 and 2012, the Department of Labor conducted more than 1,500 investigations of garment factories in Southern California, discovering labor violations including sweatshop-like conditions, 93% of the time. A recent study of workers in the poultry industry found that the vast majority were not allowed adequate bathroom breaks. Many are forced to wear diapers. Employers threaten to fire workers who complain, indicating that their free speech as well as their basic physiological needs and dignity are infringed by their employer. This is just one part of a long and continuing struggle by workers in the United States to gain the right to use the bathroom at work, right workers in other rich countries have long taken for granted. And I'm going to read you one more paragraph from Anderson to really bring the point home. This doesn't even describe the very bottom of America's wage labor system. That is occupied by immigrants, both with visas for low-wage work and undocumented. Often the former are forced by their employers to stay past their visa expiration because those same employers have confiscated their passports and threatened them with arrest or worse. One U.S. State Department investigation found that 30% of migrant laborers surveyed in one California community were victims of labor trafficking, and 55% were victims of labor abuse. Given that there are many million migrants and or undocumented workers in the United States, it is reasonable to suppose that the number of victims range from the hundreds of thousands to a few million. Abuses include fraud, being forced to work without pay, rape and sexual harassment, beatings, torture, confinement to the workplace, and to squalid housing for which extortionate rent is charged, exhausting hours, isolation, religious compulsion, and psychological manipulation and intimidation. Affected industries include hotel services, hospitality, sales, cruise, agriculture, manufacturing, janitorial services, construction, health and elder care, and domestic service. Oh, and also restaurants. This list of industries, which collectively employ tens of millions of workers, is telling. Cutting across diverse sectors of the economy, it indicates not only where vulnerable immigrants, but where U.S. citizens working in the same places are liable to suffer serious assaults on their autonomy, standing, and esteem. All right, so let's move on now. Given this information, it's difficult to mount any sort of defense of Cowen's original statement that the corporate impositions on worker dignity are just not nearly as great as Anderson makes them out to be. If you just look around, you'll see that the impositions are extremely severe. So another place where Cowen and Anderson disagree has to do with exit. So it's about the ability of exit to protect workers. Cowen admits that the cost of exiting a job can be high, and he advocates for public policies that can lower these costs. And here's a quotation from page 111 of the book Private Government, where Cowen is talking about that. For instance, we should level the playing field for employer-supplied health insurance. ACA, Affordable Care Act, attempts to do this partly with its Cadillac tax. And we should make immigration status for many workers less tied to remaining at particular jobs. The reality is that many cases of worker dependence on corporations spring from bad government decisions rather than directly from markets or the nature of the corporate employment relationship. So what does Anderson think? Well, Anderson agrees with Cowen that lowering the cost of exit is a good thing. According to Anderson, though, these changes are not going to be enough. And here's a quotation from Anderson about that from page 141 of Private Government. When workers have only exit rights and no voice, this amounts to a grant to the dictatorial employer to harvest the entire producer's surplus, all the benefits that make their job better than the worker's next best alternative that would otherwise accrue to workers before the job gets so intolerable that they quit. So that was kind of a complicated quotation. Let's break it down and explore what it means. Imagine that my employer pays me X dollars, and they pay Y dollars for my health insurance, and then they use about Z dollars in order to create a workplace environment that's free from sexual harassment and other forms of abuse. Now imagine that my next alternative pays less than that. Imagine that they pay, a slightly less money. They give me less health care, and they spend the fewer resources in order to create an environment that's free of abuse. What my employer can now do is lower the amount that I am given along all three of those dimensions until the point where it's at least as good as my next available option, and they can just pocket the change, right? And so what they can do is, in other words, they can decrease my working conditions to the point at which it's just slightly better than or even equal to my next alternative, and then just harvest the surplus, right? So exit isn't going to be enough to protect the interests of workers for that reason, even if we make the cost of exit go down. So Cowen's final argument has to do with efficiency. Now, Anderson and Cowen both agree that large, hierarchically managed firms are more efficient than workplace democracies due to economies of scale. And so the real question that we need to ask is, are the reforms Anderson is advocating for, because remember, she's not advocating for going all the way to full-on workplace democracy, are her reforms going to lead to less efficiency? And then two, to what extent is this a problem? So Anderson's response to one is really simple. It's to say that we don't actually have good evidence right now that increasing the voice that workers have is going to lead to inefficiency. In some cases, it might, but we don't have good evidence that it's going to do that in all of cases. And certainly in a lot of the cases that Anderson's talking about, where we're going to have, voice is going to be used to decrease the levels of sexual harassment or other forms of abuse, like that, it's really not clear why anybody would think that would lead to less efficiency. So that's a response to this first question about are the reforms Anderson is advocating for going to bring about less efficiency? It's just not clear, and in some cases it seems like the answer is probably no. But a response to two is, I think, a little more important. What she says is that it's wrong to see efficiency as this most important criterion when we're evaluating private governments. Because when we measure efficiency by market outcomes, and we said this is the most important criterion, what we're saying is that even marginal improvements in something like share price or the profits earned by corporation is going to trump the interests that workers have to avoid abuse of power and severe assaults upon their dignity. So Anderson's solution is simple. I'm going to just end with a quotation from page 143 of Private Government. Let workers speak for themselves in the context of a system of workplace governments in which they have a voice.